And let's now take you live to The Hague. As you can see there, outside the International Court of Justice, that is the South African legal team that has now arrived. In the next short while, they will be presenting the case. We expect the oral arguments to be heard at around 11 o'clock. And we'll also be speaking to our International News Editor Sophie Mokoena. As you can see there, she is right side outside the ICJ. Sophie, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. A lot of anticipation, of course, ahead of South Africa's oral arguments. What can you tell us?
Yes, indeed, the South African team has just arrived. As you can see, the car leaving, the legal team has just arrived, and the officials from the Department of International Relations, led by the DG Zain Dango. In terms of the Department of Justice, you have Minister Ronald Lamula leading the delegation from the Department of Justice, and of course the Senior Counsel, the King's Counsel, the junior attorneys who are assisting the senior members of the team. Earlier on, I spoke to the members of the legal team. They told me that they are ready, and pointing out that today the world will witness history. Outside the court, you have demarcated areas where you are going to have people protesting already. As you can see, the net sound there, the people who are supporting the legal team, particularly those who are supporting Palestine, are already here and waiting for the proceedings to start at 11 South African time, and we will definitely go across and speak to some of people who are here to protest. We know that South Africa's interest here is to ensure that the court is able to issue a provisional measure in terms of halting bombardment in Gaza, while the real matters will be ventilated later. When I spoke to some of the people who are familiar with how this court operates, I was told that it looks like the real case, it will start on the 5th of February with the announcement by this court in terms of South Africa's request, and then a date will be made available in terms of when will the real hearing in relation to declaring what's happening in Gaza as a genocide by the court, based on what South Africa will be presenting before the court. But today it is that urgent request that the court must issue a provisional measure to halt what's happening at Gaza. You know that both Israel and South Africa are signatories of the Genocide Convention, and therefore they will be compelled by this court in terms of abiding by the court's decisions. We don't know which way will this court go, but it was based on the fact that the UN systems failed to resolve that matter. You know that on many occasions the Security Council had to deal with this issue, and some countries, the veto powers coming into play, particularly big ones in relation to resolutions that are calling for permanent ceasefire. And therefore, South Africa decided that as part of the international community, members of the United Nations and members of the international systems in relation to the World Court, they will use available means to ensure that the war or the bombardment by Israel on Gaza does come to an end, because many people who are affected are ordinary citizens. Aldrin?
Earlier on, Sophie, you also indicated that initially the program was scheduled to have 2 hours for oral arguments. This is now for South Africa as well as Israel tomorrow, but that has been increased by an hour. Why is that?
Well, you know that actually, because this was an urgent request just for provisional measures, South Africa was just supposed to present its request in 2 hours. There was no need for Israel to come back and also present its case. But Israel took a decision that they will come, and they made a request that they want to also make a statement. We call these statements, it's speeches, it's not arguments, no or questions and back and forth. And therefore, after Israel requested 3 hours, the court took a decision to allocate an extra hour to South Africa to present its statement or statements, speeches by different members of the team. And therefore, what you will hear at 11 o'clock South African time will be statements or the speeches from different members of the team based on their expertise, those with vast experience in relation to international law, some giving a perspective why we are here, and others presenting a statement in relation to what needs to happen and what these provisional measures are about. And therefore, tomorrow we will have the legal team from Israel who will also state their case. We expect them. I've spoken to ministers and members of the IDF, that is Israel Defense Force, on many occasions. I think their argument is going to be this is self-defense. But the question is, self-defense in your country? No, it is not in their country, but it is outside their country because they are bombarding Gaza, which is part of Palestine. And therefore, the other issue will be Israel arguing that it is allowed when there's a war. And the question is this a war? Is this a conflict? Is this a one-way traffic in terms of bombardment? These are the issues that the judges will have to grapple with, because when you look at a war, it must have a front line. A war, it must be military to military. But in Gaza, do you have a proper military fighting with IDF, or it's just a guerrilla warfare? These are some of the issues that the court will grapple with. And remember, our former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseleke will join the bench, because a member country who is involved in the matter is allowed to second or recommend a judge to preside on this matter. We know that Justice Kadi Dire is not yet here. He is starting on the 1st of February. And that is why South Africa took a decision to ask the former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseleke to join this team. I haven't seen him because you know that we are at the hotel where we have the legal team, but Chief Justice Dikgang Moseleke, because he's part of the bench, he's staying away from the legal team because he must apply his mind independently.
Sophie, it's Sherman Brycebees in Johannesburg. Great to see you in The Hague. We missed each other here in South Africa, and I think the extension really speaks to the complexity of this case. There are 15 justices plus the 2 ad hoc justices, and I think, Eldrin, what that speaks to is the ability of justice sometimes to engage with the defense or the prosecutorial teams. They sometimes have questions, and for 15 justices plus the 2 ad hoc justices to have enough time to engage, to ask questions, to challenge some of the arguments being put forward. 2 hours is a very short time for 15 plus 2 to really have
also
time
considering how complex this matter is.
Right. I mean, you've seen how constitutional court trials go, or the Supreme Court in the United States. Judges sometimes jump right in and ask questions of the defense or the prosecutors as they are making their argument. And I think you're going to see that play itself out when the ICJ sits later this morning. Eldrin, I think you have to ask her.
Yes, indeed, Shawan, you are correct. We are told.
You can go ahead.
We are told that when the members of the bench want clarity, South Africa will have to respond in writing, because the members of the legal team would want to consult the government in terms of how they should handle this matter, because it is not a straightforward criminal case with their expertise. These are international matters and global issues where you have to really get information from your member country or your client, which is a country, because it is state to state. Remember, with International Court of Justice, it's all about state and a state. It's not individuals. And therefore, we were told yesterday by the South African team that should members of the bench seek clarity on certain matters, they will respond in writing.
Yeah.
Shawan.
I also wonder, Sophie, because we've been receiving some calls from our listeners as well saying that, but South Africa hasn't been as forthright when it comes to Hamas, for instance. Do you think tomorrow, when this matter is being heard, at least the statements being made by Israel, that Israel will bring this element up as well? That this applicant that has brought this matter before the court hasn't been as forthright when it comes to Hamas and in its condemnation?
Well, I think Israel will try to do that, because you'd recall that they launched the operation hunting Hamas, and we are told that they are likely to use that. But we know that there's evidence that South Africa has condemned what happened on the 7th of October. You recall that we cover that incident or that attack extensively. There's a record, there are sound bites in the archives of broadcasters, print media. You can just Google, you'll see South Africa condemning Hamas actions. You'd recall even when the South African president, in his capacity as the president of the governing party, the African National Congress, at that NEC outside there, was flanked by NEC members, them wearing the Palestinian scarf. He pointed out, he did condemn Hamas. We've seen Dr. Naledi Pandor making similar statements, but the problem is that South Africa always emphasizes the rights of the Palestinian to self-determination, because this has been a campaign that South Africa has waged for many, many years. When the ANC took power, the former president of the country, the then President Nelson Mandela, talking about, yes, South Africa is free, but as long as Palestine is not free, South Africa will continue to support Palestine, because during the struggle, Palestinians were also supporting South Africa while they were waging their own struggle. You would recall during the inauguration of former President Nelson Mandela in 1994, never, 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 never again. And this was also directed at the global community, that there shouldn't be any suppression of one nation by the other. You know that this was based on the fact that in 1994, when we were busy preparing for elections, there was a genocide unfolding in Rwanda. The Rwandese did consult the African National Congress at that time. That's what former President Thabo Mbeki told me at some point in time. And they couldn't focus on what was happening in Rwanda, because they were also dealing with internal problems in South Africa, where there was also violence in some provinces. And they couldn't focus on pushing the then apartheid government that was also supporting some rebels in Rwanda to stop supplying arms to the rebels, which led to the genocide in Rwanda. And I know, I've spoken to Madiba many times privately and publicly. He was very aggrieved that they couldn't intervene there. The same with former President Thabo Mbeki. If you go to the archives of SABC, every time when he talks about Rwanda, incidentally 30 years on, he always mentioned the fact that they couldn't intervene because they also had their own internal violence challenges ahead of elections. But this is something that South Africa always talk about, and therefore that never, 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 never again, it will ring loud here in these chambers today when we look at what's happening in Palestine. It is not a challenge, a war of words between South Africa and Israel. It is an international matter that South Africa feels strong that it has to be adjudicated or be handled by international systems, because the United Nations, when it was formed in 1948, and I think Shewe knows better, based at the United Nations, the intention was to ensure that we don't see any war again, and therefore these other organs of the UN are there to support that quest for peace worldwide. And therefore the World Court has to come in when countries can't agree. You also have another process, the International Criminal Court. It is also based here at The Hague. South Africa has also lodged a case within the International Criminal Court. There, the prosecutor must do his work. And there you are looking at individuals, because the International Criminal Court does look at individuals who have committed atrocities, genocide, war against humanity. And therefore, I think Shawan can even elaborate further. As we speak, I can see, maybe my colleague can pan to my left, the DG Zain Dango arriving there. You can see them with the South African regalia, the DG Zain Dango walking towards the court, as you can see. DG, how are you? Is the team ready? Is the team ready, DG? DG, are you ready? You can see the DG and the spokesperson of the Department of Justice. You can see them there. They are walking, and yeah, we are expecting more people to arrive here outside Shawan and Aldrin.
Yeah, Sophie Mokoena, they're joining us from outside the International Court of Justice. Of course, that's where the matter will be heard any moment from now at around 11 o'clock, so 29 minutes from now. But you quickly want to touch on the issue in relation to Hamas before the International Court, and also sometimes the limitations, though, when it comes to that argument.
Just to emphasize the point, right? People ask the question, why is South Africa only targeting Israel and why not Hamas? The ICJ only deals with disputes between states. Hamas is not a state. Hamas is going to be dealt with by the International Criminal Court. That is a court in The Hague that deals with individuals and individual crimes against humanity. This is a question of international law. These are two member states of the United Nations. As Sophie mentioned, the International Court of Justice is the judicial organ of the United Nations system. You have the Secretariat, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, and then you have the ICJ. And this is to settle disputes between states that have territorial disputes. Think Venezuela, Guyana right now. Other examples, South Africa, Namibia back in the day, which was then known as Southwest Africa. Young people might not remember that. And so that is where the ICJ has purview. The ICC, down the road from the ICJ in The Hague, will deal with individual criminality. Let's not conflate issues. Let's not talk about the independence. There was a tweet earlier, or an X earlier, about the independence of the ICJ. Look at the makeup of the courts. It's a judge from India, Morocco, yes, the United States, France. Yeah. I had the list in front of me, but just look at the makeup of the court and then come back and tell me if you think they're independent or not.
Okay, let's quickly go to this clip. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that he wants to make a few points clear. He says that Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population. Lots of reaction to that, considering that the occupation started in 1967.
A few points absolutely clear. Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population. Israel is fighting Hamas terrorists, not the Palestinian population. And we are doing so in full compliance with international law. The IDF is doing its utmost to minimize civilian casualties, while Hamas is doing its utmost to maximize them by using Palestinian civilians as human shields. The IDF urges Palestinian civilians to leave war zones by disseminating leaflets, making phone calls, providing safe passage corridors, while Hamas prevents Palestinians from leaving at gunpoint, and often with gunfire. Our goal is to rid Gaza of Hamas terrorists and free our hostages. Once this is achieved, Gaza can be demilitarized and de-radicalized, thereby creating a possibility for a better future for Israel and Palestinians alike.
Well, your take on what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say there, once again, of course, coming before Israel would have their case being heard tomorrow, their take on this matter that has been brought by South Africa.
He's essentially, Aldrin, ventilating some of the arguments you're going to hear when Israel defends itself in the court tomorrow. Arguments that Hamas is using human shields, that Israel takes great care in terms of its precision strikes. Of course, the reality is, of course, that civilians are the majority of casualties in Gaza. So it's a difficult case to make in front of these justices, and they are going to really have to pronounce here on whether the actions of Israel, whether they argue that they are using precision strikes and taking great care. This is where this court is going to have to pronounce itself as to whether it meets the standard set in terms of the international law in terms of self-defense, but also Israel's responsibilities in terms of it being a signatory to the Genocide Convention it signed in 1948. And when did it sign it? Soon after an atrocity was committed against Jews, particularly in Europe.
Sharon Bryce-Pease, our correspondent based in the United Nations, but now joining us in the Republic of South Africa.